Afternoon, everybody. I think we're like a couple minutes from getting started, but no reason to be draconian about the time limits, and I say that because I might run long too. Thanks everybody for coming out. This is the last session of MIX here. This is the true statement to the troopers of MIX here. Was anybody at Andy Hood's session on combining technology and design at 9 o'clock Monday, or 11:30, the first session Monday? I went to a lot of design sessions here, and they've made me really self-conscious about the UI on my presentation and on my demo application here. So I'm not sure if that was a good thing, but we'll get to that. He also said it was nice to be the first presenter because the last time he was at MIX, he was on the last session and the last day, and he said everybody was just staring at him glassy-eyed like zombies, and I'm just, sorry? Oh, with hangovers. Yeah, so I'm just going to throw that out there here. The session here, it's called the OpenRasta Framework for Building RESTful Applications, and I read that out. That's not actually the title I submitted it under. Mine was the OpenRasta, the REST framework that MVC wants to be. I didn't really. I guess they're looking to be a little less confrontational. It's probably a good thing. It sets the expectations a little bit better here. So I just like writing presentation abstracts. I hope it translates well to the presentation itself. But I got a little bit to talk about, and I do want to get to code here. How many people are familiar with MVC? And I hope everybody's hands put up. If you're not putting your hand up, I'm going to assume you're familiar with MVC anyway, so it doesn't actually matter if you answered yes to the question, because I am going to be making comparisons to MVC because it's just kind of natural. OpenRasta is an MVC-like framework. The brainchild of Sebastian Lamla, who is in the audience, showed up about 15 minutes. I was kind of looking forward to him not being here because then he'd have to watch the presentation with everybody else, and I could make wild accusations, and he could only just kind of yell at the screen. But he is here. So that means that if you have any questions, just get up, go talk to him. And the basis of the framework it's more kind of standards-based than MVC is. It's based on the principles of REST and HTTP, and that's more of interest academically than in principle, because from my perspective as somebody who's used the framework and followed it, it's just kind of cool, really. But I am going to talk about the parts of REST and HTTP that I think are relevant to OpenRasta before we start looking at some code here. REST, the only thing you really need to know is that it's based on resources. It's based on things, customers, invoices, and the representation of them. From an MVC point of view, a resource, a customer, you want to look at a customer, and how do you want it represented? For the most part, that's as a web page. You know, the World Wide Web is, in some degrees, a REST implementation. You've got a resource, and you want it represented, and that's done with HTML or ASPX. Okay? OpenRasta takes it a little bit further, because there are more and more often these days. If you saw I can't remember his name, Douglas P's part of the presentation yesterday, there are more and more often we're representing resources, JSON, XML, Atom, RSS. I don't want to go too far into that aspect of the keynote, but he did make that point rather well, I think, in that these days it's very important that we represent our resources in a more appropriate fashion. It's not always going to be HTML, and that's kind of the view that MVC takes, is that first and foremost you're going to display it as a web page. Now, that's not entirely true, but it serves my purposes, so I'm going to make the claim anyway. HTTP, the HTTP is, the interesting thing about HTTP is that the browsers work with it. There's a lot of stuff that's done in ASP.NET. I don't want to belabor this point too much because it's going to come off sounding like a rant, and I don't really mean it as a rant, but web forms and ASP.NET goes to a lot of trouble to kind of hide the details of HTTP. And there was some good reasons for it back then. But the fact is that it hides a problem that isn't really that hard. Web applications aren't that hard to build. And it really helps to know a little bit about HTTP and how it works. And the core concepts with respect to Rasta are up here. We've already got verbs. Get and post are very common. Put and delete there's others. I only listed 4 of them. I think there's at least 4 others, maybe more. And I think you can even define your own. But for purpose of our presentation here, get and post are the common ones that you'll be working with. And the browsers all support this. They've supported it for years and years and years. So why not take advantage of those semantics when you're dealing with your framework? URIs, aka URLs, are not entirely synonymous, but it's just how are you going to access your resource? And URLs are a very common way to do that. Response and request headers are probably one of the key things that are hidden from us in the framework. We know that they're there. We use them. We got requests. There's the server variables and all that other stuff. There's a lot of good information in the response and request headers that we'll see, and that OpenRasta takes advantage of. And I don't know why I put 500 as the first status code here. It could have been after my first draft of the demo application, but we've all seen status codes here. 404, number 200 is hopefully the most common, and there are lots of status codes, tons of them. Unauthorized, for example, not found, moved temporarily, and moved permanently. All these status codes are defined by HTTP, and we can take advantage of them to define behaviors in our applications. And my clock hasn't started, which is a good thing, actually. But if we get to it, we'll show you how we can take advantage of those. Back to OpenRasta here. I was lying, actually, about going to talk to Seb about questions. If you have any questions, raise your hand. Stop me at any time, and I'll do my best to answer them. Resources, codecs, and handlers. Another name for this is model view controller. It's a good analogy to make. It could be crude. I don't know. I like making the analogy. Resources are what we're representing, similar to the model in MVC. And codecs is probably the most confusing term in the framework. It stands for code and decode, I believe, because the alternative is serialization and deserialization, and that would be CDES, which sounds even weirder. So it's codec, which means how are we going to code your resource and how are we going to decode our resource? Okay, basically how do we convert it into the representation that we want, and how do we get it from that representation back into our object format? And handlers, it's another name for controllers, and they are synonymous for all intents and purposes. And with that, that's all I want to talk about before. The good thing, actually, I'll get back to this. The good thing about me doing this presentation instead of Sebastian is that I can talk realistically about the downsides of the framework, and there's nothing really he can do about it. I'll get to that. Luckily, they're not insurmountable errors, and every framework has its good and bad point. I'm going to cross our fingers there for a brief moment. And we'll take a look at the application. The format of it, the solution thing, I'm showing this because everybody shows this. It's not that interesting. It's folders. It's a straight C# application here. You've got handlers and models like you would in an MVC application. You've got a views folder, which none of this is really necessary. It's just what's created out of the box. There's a Visual Studio project template that's quite useful. when you go new project and you install OpenRasta for the first time, you get this nice little, wherever I put it. Oh, you know what? I didn't actually install it on my laptop, but you do get a nice little Visual Studio template that wires up all of the little bits and pieces of OpenRasta for you. Let's hide that sucker. The core of OpenRasta here is where you start is the configuration. This is similar to where you're setting up your routes in, sorry, we're close to Texas. I'm going to pronounce it properly. Where you set up your routes in an MVC application. Okay, so instead of setting up your routes in global ASAX, we do it in a configuration. It's just a class that implements iConfiguration source, and they're not actually called routes or routes. They're URIs, right? So you're not going to sit here and watch me type for a lot of this, but when you're setting up the OpenRasta configuration, it's done manually, and this is one of the sticking points that could be improved, I think, a little bit, is that there's no kind of auto configuration. There's nothing that says, for all my resources, configure it for a controller called this or a handler called this in a view that's in this location. Okay, yeah, it's all got to be done manually, and it's not really that bad. I don't know how hard it would be to implement. I'm just saying I'm a user and I want it. So we got our resource space has. There are 4 things you need to configure for the most part here. Every time you want to represent something or work with something. What is the resource? How are you going to get access to it? How are you going to represent it? And what is the handler that's going to do the glue that deals with it? Okay? So we start with the resource. For what I'm doing here, I'm going to just show a home page, a simple home page, and the resource in that case is a home resource. Now, on a home page, what is our resource? What is our thing? It's likely a very conceptual thing. It could be an amalgamation of a whole bunch of things. If it's an intranet, maybe it's your overdue customers, your upcoming bills or something like that. For your homepage, it just could be a whole bunch of things, but it's essentially just a class with some properties on it. So we're going to deal with a home resource, and I'll show you what that looks like shortly here. And how are we going to access it? What's the URL? We're going to use it /home. We could do /, we could do /customers, we could do /whatever. But how are we going to access it? In this case, we're going to access our home resource at home. What's the handler that we're going to use? A home handler. And I'll create that shortly. I've already created the home resource, but I haven't created the home handler because this is actually one of the more interesting things, I think, of OpenRasta is the handlers compared to controllers in MVC. And if you're more analytical than I am, you'll notice that when I define this, there's a really key piece that seems to be missing compared to setting up your routes/routes in MVC. And I'll talk about that a little shortly, a little bit later. The last piece is how are you going to represent this thing? We're going to render it as an ASPX page. Now, that's another assumption or a lack of assumption that OpenRasta does. It doesn't automatically assume that you're going to use an ASPX page to render these things. Okay, it could be any number of things that you use to render this resource. And that's one of the more interesting things. So I want to kind of barrel through the rest of this, the rest of this aspect of it. Because the rest of this, other than the home handler, looks very much like it would in MVC. And the more interesting one will be when I get to the second route here. Our home resource, just a class that has a name. And on our home page, we're going to say hello to that name. Okay, so let's create our home handler. This is the the new features of Visual Studio 2010 available now in Visual Studio 2008 as a plugin at jetbrains.com/resharper for the low, low price of $200. So if you want to get Visual Studio functionality now, then that's the way to do it. So our home handler. We create a class called home handler. And we want to get a home resource and display it in that web page. Let me show the web page just to get it over with, because it's almost identical to MVC, and any templating language will have stuff like this. This is really quite boring, this here. We got, it uses master pages here, and it's got its own little syntax. Inherits from resource view, home resource. You know, we're just changing the names. Hello resource.name instead of hello viewdata.model.name in this case. Okay, so let's get back to the home handler, which is where all the good stuff happens. This is similar to the controller. We want to send a home resource to the web page. How are we going to do that? What's one of the things? Let's go back to this configuration and look at what's missing from here compared to MVC. People that are familiar with MVC, what do you think is missing from this thing here? I'm going to give you the answer here. Don't tell my daughter I did that, but I am going to just go straight to it, just because. Well, I don't actually have that much patience with her either. What we're missing here is there's no concept of an action here. Okay, in MVC you say, you know, squiggly brackets controller slash squiggly brackets slash action. So what is our action here? I'll give you the answer there too. I don't have to actually. But the action comes from the presentation slides that I talked about earlier. HTTP has all the actions given to you already. So why do we need to define our own? There's get, there's post, there's put, delete. There's all kinds of actions. Okay. In this case, you can define your own if you want, provided that your client supports them. But for the most part, browsers support get and post already. So let's just use those actions. Oh crap. Now the timer starts, and I'm already down 20 minutes. So we have an action already defined for us. Get. Public. And what do we want to return from this? Well, we're returning a home resource from it. And I'll skip to the money shot. And I'll just put a name of Moo. Okay? There's how we send stuff back to the client here. And let's just, it's imperative in demos that I prove to you that I'm not doing anything, so I do have to show this. Did I compile that, sir? There we go. Hello, Moo. Okay. Oh, yeah, it's pink. I'm gonna do a little a story here that has nothing to do with the presentation. I've been using Flamingo as the name of my sample application for some 5 years ago, and the story behind that is that I used to work for a company that was called DSI, and their flagship product was called IPBS in a town where they had names like JBR, like CSL, like AES. And somebody would say, just call AES, and I couldn't tell if that was the plumber or the electrician or the pool cleaner or what. Okay, so I was complaining at DSI to my coworker, and I said, there's no reason to have stupid names like this. Okay, they could be called anything. You could call the thing carpets or woodenchairs.com or something like that. People will strip away whatever meaning the name, the word has, and assign their own meaning to it. And he says, you know what, I don't buy that. You could pick something like Hippo, and people will think you're this big lumbering beast. And I think Hippo is a freaking fantastic name for a product. And I said, and he says, I don't buy it. And I started listing off examples. Amazon, for example, Sun, Google, Java, eBay, Oracle. You know, car companies have known this for years. Have you ever stopped to think what civic actually means? Okay, it's just a word that looks really cool when you put it together. So that's actually my foray into design. Don't name your company. So anyway, this was in a company in the Bahamas. I live in the Bahamas, and the national bird of the Bahamas is flamingo. So I said the next application I build is going to be called Flamingo, just because it's a good name. At least I thought so at the time. I didn't think through the color palette, and I didn't think through the fact that it's basically the word flaming with an O at the end. But it's good that the next application I built was a demo app. So that's my little aside into. And the short version is just don't name your company after initials unless you're an offshoot of IBM. Okay. So that was the master page from there. Any questions or any comments about how this looks before I give it away for you guys? What's one major thing that would differentiate this from no base class? No base class. This I absolutely adore. Okay, there's no base controller on this. This handler you created. Can you imagine how you would test this? Of course you can imagine how to test this. You create a home handler, and you call get on it, and you test to see what the result is that you're getting back from it. There's no controller context that you have to wire up. You know, there's no mocking that needs to be done on this particular one. Okay, and the next thing, we're not returning an action result. We're returning the thing, the resource that we're rendering, the resource that we're going to represent here. Okay? How that's done, I haven't a clue, really. But as a consumer of the thing, I really appreciate this. Now, if I wanted to support post, I don't have any prizes, but that's okay, because the question would be too easy anyway. Public void post. And it would take now I can post to this URL. Let's do that quickly, and I will do that with the magic of code snippets. I've created a form here using similar format to what you see in MVC. We've scoped it to an HTML form. You enter a name, and it provides a template xhtml.text box for a resource.name. And it just says hello, repeats that name back to you. Okay? There's no template for a submit button because it's not hard to type that out, really. Input type equals submit. I stole that joke from Sebastian, which is why none of you are laughing. Okay. I am actually returning a home resource back here. And in this case, all I'm going to do is return that same resource back. Just because all I care about is the semantics here. So it's not particularly useful. We're taking a home resource that's being posted to the server, and we're sending it back to that same page just so we can show it, just so we can display it back. So we start with hello moo, which is the default because we've used a get on here. And that's where Firebug really becomes useful. So we've got get/home. Now we're going to post something. Ugh. I kind of have to disable Vimperator. You know what? No, I'm not going to do that. Submit the query. And now it's going to say hello quack right back at you. All right. Let's get to a more useful example here, a more interesting one. This Flamingo is, if you read the byline there, is a music library application. I've got a database that, time permitting, will connect up to a little bit later. But on the next page, the resource that we want to represent is a catalog of songs. So let's create, we're going to start off with, it's going to be a web page. Again, we're going to be rendering an ASPX page. And at least we're going to start that way. And it's exactly the same as a home resource. We're taking the resource that we want to represent, a catalog resource, and we're displaying it in a web page. I've already created the catalog resource, which is just a class that's got an IEnumerable of song objects, and a song is just a class that has a title, an artist, an album, and a genre. We've got a catalog view, which for completeness I'll show. For each song, we iterate over it and display a row in a table. That's it. And the catalog handler, which I will create. Oops. Return a new catalog resource, and we'll give it a list of songs. I'll create this list of songs here shortly here. One thing I'm going to do here is I'm using the God's version of the word catalog here, but we're in the US, so they don't like using UE at the end of words, unless you're using a word like Q in which they throw a whole bunch of them. So we want to actually provide this resource at a couple of URIs. So the API allows us to define any number of URIs to handle this resource. Okay, and if we wanted to, no, that's all I'm going to do there. So now we can access this resource at either one of those APIs. Now let's provide a list of songs here on our catalogs. And I'm just going to provide a pre-populated list here. This is, that's the soundtrack for my funeral here. I think it's very important that everybody builds a soundtrack for their funeral, okay, because you do want to provide, I've also left aside money for booze for the party. That last song is for my grandmother because she loves the Pussycat Dolls, and she is going to outlive me. So we provide a list of songs, and we go back to our page catalog. I should be doing this at the top, actually. And it's not either catalog or catalog, and let's get rid of Firebug here. And that's all well and good, whatever. Now what we want to do is instead of rendering this, instead of representing this as a web page, we want to represent it as in some other format. We'll say JSON format. Well, no, we'll say XML format, because then I can display it in the browser here. So instead of displaying this as an ASPX page, let's go back to our configuration and say, how are we going to represent this as an XML document, or as in XML format instead of ASPX? So we don't want to render it as ASPX, as XML data contract. Out of the box, OpenRasta supports ASPX, XML format, and JSON format. XML and JSON format are supported just because it's dead simple. There's built-in serializers and deserializers for it. You can create your own codecs to support RSS, Atom, any other standards, proprietary formats. OpenSearch is one. You could do OData if you really wanted to. No. Shut up. So you can create your own, and it's very easy to do. I'll show one really briefly at the end here. So in this case, we want to represent this as an XML data contract. And in MVC, if you wanted to, this isn't what you would do in MVC. In MVC, and I believe in WCF REST as well, you wouldn't handle this in the configuration so much. You would go back to your controller, and you say you want to return an XML result. I'm not even sure if they have an XML result. You would say you want to return an XML result. You may have a method called getCustomerAsXML or something like that. But here in OpenRasta, you define that in the configuration. And now we go back to our catalog handler. Any changes we need to make here? That's a trick question. No, we don't need to make any changes here. Okay? This is completely divorced from the representation of your resource. It's one of the reasons we don't need a base class. This doesn't care if you're representing this as an ASPX page or an XML file, data object, or as a JSON object. Okay? All we need to do is do the configuration, say how are we going to represent this resource, and then we go back here, refresh the page, and we get a nice little XML document instead. What if we want to support both XML and ASPX? Okay, that's the syntax for it, as XML data contract and as rendered by ASPX. There's no prizes, so I won't care if you don't shout out the answer. But what's going to happen when I refresh this page? HTML? Who says HTML? Who says XML? The air conditioning is way too high for the rest of you to be asleep in here. So I'm going to assume that you just don't know, because the alternative kind of frightens me a little. So it means you don't care, and I just can't have that. So we're going to refresh this. I am going to refresh this. And the fact that I went back to check means that I've given away the answer. We're going to get HTML back, even though we've defined XML first in the configuration. Here's where we're going to break open Fiddler, which I thought I did have open. Okay. Why did we get HTML back instead of XML in this case? This is, yes, Rob. Oh, man. You've been paying attention. You weren't drunk last night. This is where our response headers come in. Let's break open Fiddler. Do we need? No, let's not. We don't even need to break open Fiddler. Let's just do this in Firebook first. Okay? Get. And we take a look at our content type. Oh, I love when that works. The content type here is text/HTML. When we've defined our codec for ASPX, it says, what is the content type that corresponds to this codec? In that case, it's text/HTML. If we submit this request with the content type associated with XML, then we get XML document back. And how do we do that? That's where Fiddler comes in. And for Fiddler, we need to make a couple of changes. Whoops. Serves me right for relying on the number pad. I'm going to send some traffic to Fiddler here instead. Refresh the page, and back in Fiddler here, now we get the catalog. And the reason I'm going to use Fiddler here is because then I can doctor up the requests that we're using here. So in the request, we can see, again, content type text/HTML. Let's change this a little bit. Go back, grab that. There's our catalog, and I'll execute it again just so I've got two things side by side to look at. There's our headers, text/HTML. Let's, in the request builder, if you're not familiar with header, then it's too late. We're at the end of the conference. You can't go back in time and look at the debugging in Fiddler presentation that was on earlier today. Nope, that's not right. Is it? It's accept. Help me out, Seb. Is it accept? Is that the one we want? Okay. Accept. So I'm going to change the content type. Execute. Same URL, except that the text that we get back is XML. Okay? So now what we've got here is using the existing browser support. You, as the client, have to remember to say, I want to get this as XML. Same as you would in any other framework, but the way you would do that in MVC is you would have either a parameter in the method. It says format. You know, I think that's how WCF REST does it. You say format, you add a query string parameter, format equals XML, or maybe you have a separate method, get this as XML, or maybe you could probably do it with attributes, I imagine, as well. Okay? When in fact, there's a built-in way already in the browser. You don't need to do any kind of support for this. You just need a framework that already supports it. You want to support JSON as JSON data contract. There we go. Same URL, getting 3 different formats back in whatever format you like. Okay? Any questions on that? Fantastic. What was I going to display next here? There's something important before I move on. Can't be that important. Another aspect of OpenRasta is that the kind of plug-in nature, the pluggable nature of it. Now we've got the concept of a pipeline, an OpenRasta pipeline. Now pipeline it's not a nice word to use because it brings up images of the ASP.NET pipeline, which is kind of cumbersome to use here. But a pipeline is, in a sense, just a series of steps, things that happen when you get a request. There's things like which resource does this URL match to? Which codec do we need to represent it? Which handler do we need to? All these things are what OpenRasta does when it gets a request. So in order, and the nice thing about it is that you can plug into it at any step in the way. I'm not going to sit here and build something that plugs into the pipeline contributor because I've already done it, or I've already stolen it from somebody, and I'm just going to talk about it a little bit here. These 2 lines highlight a couple of things about OpenRasta. I'm going to come back to the first one that says uses custom dependency. I'm just going to talk about uses.nhibernate persistence. Now we want to get this catalog to retrieve our songs from a database. So we need, and I'm using nhibernate for that. And this isn't, I'll provide this code on my blog later here. So if I talk through this pretty quickly, then that's why. And it doesn't have support. This is confusing. This doesn't have support for nhibernate right out of the box because it shouldn't really. It's using some extension methods that I've created. Okay? This is the important line right here. Uses pipeline contributor. Okay? And I've created a session initialization contributor, which is just a class that implements iPipeline contributor. And if you ignore the man behind the curtain here and we go straight to this method, and I hope John Bristow doesn't see that because I stole that from him. This is the method that you have to implement with iPipeline contributor. We're going to notify our pipeline runner that we want to execute this initialize session method before this stage, this existing stage. There are a list of, I don't know, about a dozen or 15 odd stages that happen when you, when OpenRasta handles a request. And this is where you can plug into it. Now what we want to do, if you're familiar with nhibernate, what we need to do is we need to open up a session whenever we make a request. And we open up an nhibernate session, and we need to do that. In this case, we want to do that before the handler is selected, because in the handler, that's where we're going to be using that session. So before we select our handler, we want to initialize an nhibernate session. This here has nothing really to do with OpenRasta, but here we're getting our session factory, and I'll show you the session factory really shortly. And then what we're doing is we're adding the session to our resolver. Who's familiar with inversion of control? Okay. Dependency injection is baked into the framework, support for it. So we, in our contributors, in our handlers, anywhere in the framework, you have access to inversion of control. You have inversion of, like an inversion control container readily available. Out of the box, it comes with its own internal implementation, which I believe is recommended that you don't use, but it's fantastic for demos. And you're going to go away and say, I'm just going to use this for production, and blame me for it when it doesn't work. But that's okay. It's also got support for Castle Windsor and inject. There are separate implementations for both of those. And I didn't need to call it inject because all of you are here and not in Nate's talk down the hall. So Nate, that's your plug, all right? Let's take a look at, so here what we're doing is we're creating an nhibernate session, and we're adding it to our inversion of control container. And back in our configuration, we're doing the same thing. We're taking an implementation, a song repository, and we're adding it to, I'm doing this backwards. It's going to look, you know what, this is going to look a lot clearer once I update my catalog handler. So let me delete some of this. Let's go with this first. Sweet. No. Get all. Now what I've done is I've added a, what are those things called? Constructor to my handler. And it takes an implementation, an iSong repository. It's an interface that I've created. Okay? Now the fact that I'm using an inversion of control container means that I don't need to worry about where this iSong repository comes from. This is my 30,000-foot view of IOC containers. As long as the container has an iSong repository, it will be able to create this catalog handler. This you'll recognize is from MVC contrib if you've used it. It's pretty much the exact same idea, except you don't need to, well, I mean, you do need to do some wiring up if you're using Windsor or inject, I believe. But you don't need any separate libraries for it. The fact that in our configuration, we add a custom dependency. It says when anything needs an iSong repository, give it this implementation of it. Okay? And now you'll notice that this repository has a dependency on iSession. And that's the beauty of inversion of control containers. They'll do that whole chain of responsibility and wire all that up for you. So that's why we need to create a contributor that opens the session factory, creates an nhibernate session, and adds it to the inversion of control container so that we can create this song repository or any class that requires an iSession. Okay? Now the actual example, you could argue, if you're paying closer attention than I probably would at this point, that you don't necessarily need a contributor for this, that you could just create it in the configuration and add it to the IOC container. The actual example that I'm going to display has the session beginning a transaction, and then there's another contributor that closes it afterwards. So in that case, you do need a pipeline contributor for it. Okay? Now, let's go back and take another look at this. Now, this is using Fluent and Hibernate to do all the mappings and get everything from the database, and that's not this talk, or not even this conference, really. But now we're getting stuff back from the database here. So now we can actually play something. This will be a good one for 3 o'clock on the last day here. So
you are going to relax. So begin by making yourself perfectly comfortable.
Yeah, let's not go any
Sit
further.
down in your favorite chair.
Okay, let's go back. I want to show you the actual application that I will be providing here. And it's got a nice little search interface. You can take the same thing and do a search, and it'll just search all the fields for it. So you can search for blue is a good one to search for. And it'll search for blue in the artist, as you see here. It'll search for blue in the title, or it'll search for blue in the genre or the album. Okay? Now, let me open up Firebug again, and just to kind of reiterate a point. We've got the search that was done using a get, and is going to catalog, search term equals blue. We can also load it via JSON. Same method up here. When we expand all this out and take a look at the response, we get HTML back. I clicked on something there. And this next one, instead, we get actual JSON objects back. Okay, so again, same object, going to the same URL, and the only difference is your content type there. All right, last little thing before the conference is done. I'm clearly talking too fast because I was way over at this point last night. I've created a console application. Okay? Now what this does, we've created ourselves an HTTP listener host with a configuration. The configuration comes from the same place as the web application. It's the exact same configuration. Go to the source, and it's the same one that I've just created. Okay? What I want to do here, and I'm initializing this, and I said, this is the URL that I want to start listening to. Okay, let me give away the punchline here. What this is going to do is going to create a console application that you can use to access your resources without requiring IIS. Okay, so when we launch this application, and remember that port number because I always forget it. Oh, there we go. Start listening. Let's go into a new tab. Oh, sorry, I have to stop because, and I'll tell you why. What this does is it frees us up from always thinking of your application in terms of web pages, in terms of ASPX pages. Now, if you're not serving up ASPX pages, you don't necessarily need to create a website, an IIS website. Okay? In this case, I'm going to delete. Let's delete all of these, except for that one. Now we're serving up our resources only with XML. So we don't need to create an IIS website. We start listening. We go to a local host, port 6689, and I've already got it in there. And now we've got the thing serving up XML without having to require an IIS website. The other nice advantage of this is that you can use this while you're testing. You've got an in-memory host that you can use to fire up, and you don't need to deal with IIS websites, and makes your Selenium tests that much easier. Okay. Now this isn't a console application. Of course, you can run it as a Windows service or anything like that. Anything that you can use to launch a console application. Any questions on that?
Is there a default service host for it out of the box?
No. No? No. The question was, is there a default service host for it out of the box? No, you have to write, even this console stuff, you have to write that. But there's, like if you look at the code for it, no, it's going to go into the framework for it, OpenRasta. Now this is actually a separate project from OpenRasta called OpenBastard. It's funny, Seb used to have an awesome picture on his blog that I think he took off to make himself look more respectable, but it did epitomize him in every single way. It was a picture of him holding a bottle of Arrogant Bastard beer and having this really glazed look on him, and it was just epitomized. But and now I've ruined it because I've told everybody about it. Any other questions? Yes. Can you say that again? How would I host it in? Can you host this in the cloud? Is what you're saying. Now, it does support medium trust environments, and Seb's going to have to help me out on this one. Can you host? Has anybody tried hosting this in Azure?
Yeah, the hosting by default has ASP.NET, so anyway you run ASP.NET, you run it on
Right. Yeah.
It works on Azure.
Yeah. So it works on Azure. Anywhere you can host ASPX. I didn't mention also that it does support also the Spark View engine. If that's a separate plugin for OpenRasta that you have to get from somewhere in Google Code. But if you don't like the web forms view engine, you can do that as well. And there's another one that's kind of built in called Sharp View. So, you know.
Is the OpenRasta, is it meant to be like Cassini for development, or can you become used in a production environment?
Yeah, you can use it in a production. It's not meant for a development environment. It's meant to separate OpenRasta, the functionality of OpenRasta, from the environments that you can run it under. You can run it under in memory. I think ASP.NET is actually part of OpenRasta, but the other environment is HTTP sys. Yes, no, yeah. So it's just to create other environments that you can run OpenRasta under, other than ASP.NET. If there are no other questions, and if there are any, you can come see me afterwards. If there are no other questions, then thanks for coming out, and I hope you had as much fun as I did at the conference.